All right, Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, striking up the live stream Friday at 11:45 a.m. Eastern time. That has been our set time to sit down with Steve Merril of Pro Sports Info to talk about the betting lines for college football each and every week, heading into week 7. Before we talk to Steve, I want to remind you that we've got our newsletter, The Voice of College Football, that gets released each and every Monday. So please send your email address to mine at MarkRogersTV@gmail, and we'll get that newsletter sent out to you each and every Monday. It's gotten a really good response. It just started in week 1. Support the channel by going down to the description section, grabbing one of the links at Amazon, and all you need to do there is do your normal shopping at Amazon. Just use the link. You don't have to buy the product. Just enter Amazon using one of the links. And we have added Spotify to our audio platform, so everything you hear right here and watch on YouTube, you can also check out the audio at Spotify, Google Play, Podbean, iTunes, and Stitcher, your audio platform of choice. All right, let's get to it with Steve Merril of Pro Sports Info. And Steve, this is the fascinating topic for me each and every week. I learn so much in terms of the betting game and the Vegas lines and so forth. So, Steve, we appreciate it each and every time. Let's dive into last night's action. Let's start with the NFL, the Giants and Eagles. I looked at it, and it's easy to say after the fact when you get the selection right and say, of course, the Eagles were going to blow out the Giants. But at the time, only 2.5 points seemed like a pretty easy selection for me, at least.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing obviously gave you concern last night was that the home teams were a perfect 5-0 on the Thursday night games this year. However, a lot of that has to do with the short scheduling week, obviously, and the travel. And both of those weren't as much of an issue last night. First of all, the Eagles are the better team. So I think the short week favors the better team because game planning becomes less of an issue and talent wins out. Normally, the home team is the better team in a lot of these games. That wasn't the case last night. And then on top of that, Philadelphia to the Meadowlands is about the shortest road trip you could have in the NFL. So the travel factor was less as well. And then you had the Eagles, of course, coming off a loss, which dropped them below 500. It was really a do-or-die situation. And the Giants are just not a good team. Watching some of the first half there, Eli Manning really looks to me like he's just going through the motions at this point. Kind of a lackluster fumble at the goal line there in the first half. And just the Giants are a difficult team to back. I actually had a best bet on them against the Panthers last week. They covered the number despite losing. I didn't want anything to do with them last night, though, as you mentioned. And Philadelphia, still a dicey team, but it looks like maybe they broke out last night, and then maybe we can start trusting them here going forward.
Yeah, for some reason, Steve, I felt pretty much the same going to Carolina last week. I was pretty confident with the Giants with almost a touchdown there, and they almost won the football game. Aside from Graham Gano, they would have. They come back and they don't play well on a Thursday night against Philadelphia, 34-13. There was also college football and rather important college football in the Big 12 with a couple teams in the middle of the pack of that conference trying to play their way into contention, with Texas Tech taking on TCU. That game was 7 to 7.5 points in regards to a line of TCU. But I would think the bigger story would be the over-under. That shouldn't have been maybe necessarily as big a surprise as it would be conventional thinking that Texas Tech and TCU are going to put up a zillion points. And it was only a 17-14 game, I believe.
Yeah, exactly. I actually had a play on Texas Tech last night, plus 7.5 for my clients. Second time this year I've gone against TCU with success. Of course, had Texas as an outright underdog winner as well against TCU a few weeks ago. Play I mentioned that I liked a lot here on the show. You know, we did the preview this past summer, and I mentioned I thought the Big 12 would really be down a notch this year, and I thought Texas was the sleeper in that conference. That loss against Maryland obviously was bad from a national title perspective in week 1, but their win against Oklahoma last week was big. I thought Oklahoma might be down a notch, although their quarterback play has been pretty good. I thought Mayfield leaving would hurt them more, but I was not big on TCU coming in. They're now, by the way, 1-4 against the number this year, Mark. They've been a huge money burner against the point spread, which shows they are an overrated team. And Texas upsetting Oklahoma last week really does give the Longhorns a chance now to still get into that playoff picture. I believe they were maybe 40-1 when we did that podcast this summer, talking about dark horses for the national title. That Maryland loss is a shame, but, you know, if they win out here, I still think they have a shot.
Steve Merril joins us from Pro Sports Info. So it's prosportsinfo.com. Please join him right there. You get the gamut, not just college football, the NFL, Major League Baseball playoffs. Of course, the championship series are starting up tonight. And of course, the NBA in just a few weeks. Or actually, I think this week,
Tuesday.
The NBA creeps up on us sooner each year.
Yeah, Tuesday night. So we're 4 days away. Yeah, they're starting about a week or two earlier than normal the last couple of seasons. But yeah, hey, there were no games this past Wednesday. It was only the second day all year that there was not a football, baseball, regular season basketball. There was a lot of NBA preseason. I actually don't mess with that. But yeah, this past Wednesday night, because the baseball playoffs ended earlier than expected, there was no football, baseball, or pro basketball regular season on Wednesdays. The only other Wednesday was the day after the All-Star game back in July.
Of course, that's the only one that comes to mind readily is, of course, during the All-Star break in baseball. Yeah, the NBA takes like a weekend off, and then they're back at it in terms of summer camps and the whole deal. All right, I'm looking at these lines, Steve, for the first time. Just open up the lines across the board, all the major Vegas books, and I get hit with the Friday night game tonight and an early game on Saturday, which strike me as underachieving teams, but getting a lot of points that are heavier than I would have anticipated. That's Arizona at Utah, with the Utes close to a 2-touchdown favorite. And I think Utah is a very sound football team, and Arizona is not. So I wouldn't be surprised if it covered, but I just did not expect anything close to that, nor in the Louisville-Boston College game. Again, Louisville, a very underachieving team, a pretty bad football team, taking on a solid but not a great team at Boston College and giving up almost 2 touchdowns in that game.
Yeah, actually had a best bet last week on Arizona. I went a perfect 4-0 last Saturday in college football on best bets. 3 of those 4 were outright underdog winners. Mississippi State over Auburn that we talked about on the show. Florida over LSU that we also talked about here on the show last week. One game we didn't get to, though, was that Arizona-California game. I also liked Arizona as an outright underdog. I thought all 3 of those teams, the wrong team was favored, and we had live home dogs. But now I'd be very careful with this situation. This reminds me of a game a few weeks ago when I had a best bet on North Carolina as a home dog when they upset Pittsburgh, and then they had to play the short week on that Thursday night on the road. I came right back and went against them with Miami. Now it's a Friday game in this situation, so Arizona does have one extra day, but it's still a short week. They're going from a home dog win to playing a better team on the road. But the line does look inflated to me, Mark. I agree it's a little higher than I thought based on that underdog win, but it does not look like a good scheduling spot for Arizona. Meanwhile, Louisville is just one of those teams I really need to see them do something before I can trust them. You have some teams this year that are really down a notch from recent years, and Louisville appears to be one of them. We talked a few weeks ago how it looks strange having Virginia as a 4.5-point favorite over Louisville, and they went out there and won by over 20. Virginia did. So I really need to see Louisville string together a few weeks of solid games before I can start backing them at the window with real money.
Always a great discussion with Steve Merril. Join him at prosportsinfo.com to get the latest on the NBA, the NFL, Major League Baseball, and, of course, college football as we dive further into the games. But before we do that, Steve, I want to continue this narrative that played itself out again last night. Texas Tech, 7 to 7.5 point dog on the road against TCU. Been tracking this since week 1 because I think this is where the value is. And I see out of at least the games I predict, which is the top 25 plus a few more relevant games. We had 6 more games last week where a substantial underdog, meaning more than a field goal, won the game outright. And that seems to be where huge value lies, with Texas, a touchdown underdog against Oklahoma, Northwestern, a 10.5 point dog at Michigan State, winning outright. Of course, Florida at home by a field goal over LSU in that game. Florida State almost pulled it off. Iowa State did as a 10-point dog against Oklahoma State. And on and on and on here. Kentucky in overtime almost pulled it off, 5.5-point dog at Texas A&M. The Auburn game, as you mentioned, with Mississippi State, a 4-point underdog winning at home. That was one of your best plays. And then late night, Utah winning at Stanford as a 3.5-point underdog. There just seemed to be 5 or 6 values per week, just looking at the top 25 and just outside the top 25, where you can find big values.
No question about it. As I mentioned, I had 4 best bets last Saturday. All 4 won. 3 of them were underdogs, and the 3 underdogs won outright. So, yeah, the money line cashed a better payoff on all 3 of those. And it's not a surprise. Historically speaking, touchdown or less underdogs in both college and pro football. If they cover, the majority of the time they win the game outright. They don't even need the points. And it's kind of counterintuitive because I do also preach every week how the lines are sharper than they've ever been in history. You know, and these point spreads land within a couple points of the majority of the games. In fact, a 6-point teaser, you can move both lines 6 points, but you got to win both plays. It's a 50-50 proposition. So that's telling you right off the bat mathematically that there's a 70% chance that any given game will land within 6 points of the spread. So it's kind of ironic that even though the majority of the games land within a touchdown, that most of these teams win outright when they cover. So you always have to feel that your underdog has a chance of winning outright. The one exception, of course, would be like Arkansas last week. They're a 35-point underdog against Alabama. They lose by 34. I didn't have anything in that game, and anybody had said they had that game pinned one way or the other is just a coin flip, you know. And I bring that up because Bama, by the way, has gone from 28 to 27.5 this week, Mark, and obviously 28 is a key number. So some of these games are just coin flips, and it's really luck either way. But when you really have a solid handicap like I did on Mississippi State, Florida, Arizona last week, yes, I thought those teams would win the games outright. I actually thought the wrong team was favored in all three of those games.
I got the big grin on my face that nobody can see because I played right into the Bama deal, because I'm the guy that says I'm just going to pick all the games. This is what I'm doing. I'm an analyst, but I'm not an odds maker. I just do this for fun. So I just pick all the top 25 games. So I ran the numbers, and this makes total sense, Steve. And the Bama situation was exactly that, a coin flip. Okay, they're a 35-point favorite, and as I mention each and every week, who knows who in the world is going to be on the field in the fourth quarter and how the coaches are going to be coaching and calling the plays, if they're just going to want to get out of town or put on the throttle and keep throwing the ball, or what the deal is going to be. And Arkansas scores with 13 seconds on the clock to take it from 41 to 34, and that's your backdoor cover, where I took Alabama to cover the 35. The same thing happened the previous week. So I ran the numbers, and I'm 70-56, Steve, against the spread, top 25 games this year. But if I take out all those games that are plus 3 touchdowns, everything over 21 points, that is basically a non-competitive game typically, except for the freakish Old Dominion, Virginia Tech type of game that happens 3 times a year. Take those out. I'm only 500 in those games because it's a coin flip. I'm 22-22 in those games. So my percentage ramps up to almost 60% picking the competitive games.
Yeah, that's great information to have. I mean, you really have to analyze, you know, it's like a professional stock trader. You want to go back and analyze your trades and see where you're making money and where you're losing money. And when you have an adequate sample set like you now have, it tells you something, and that does not surprise me. That's exactly what you want to see. You don't want to be winning all these coin flip games by 1 point and have a 60% win rate, because that means you're probably not going to do that long term. So that's a good sign. And I think when you're playing these big point spreads, the only time I really get involved, which is rare, is when I really think the favorite has motivation to win big and we get line value based on recent results. A good example was back in week 3. I had Florida, I think it was around 3 touchdowns, 21 or so, against Colorado State. They'd come off the Kentucky loss. I thought they were a good team. As we've seen, they've won every game since. I've used them several times, including last week, as I mentioned. And we had a new coaching staff, so I thought they'd continue to get better. They had the talent to blow out a team, and that was a prime example where they wouldn't take their foot off the gas pedal, and they didn't. They won by 38. But yeah, Alabama, I mean, not only the game the week before against Louisiana Lafayette, as you mentioned, but what about the game before that against Texas A&M? They win by 22 points as a 23.5-point favorite. So each of their last 3 games they have failed to cover, and it really could have gone either way. So instead of 3-3 against the number, they could still be 6-0 against the spread. That's why I find it interesting that the line this week against Missouri dropped from 28 to 27.5. I don't know if I'll be involved. I probably won't be, but it's tempting you almost to take Alabama as you feel like they'll win by exactly 28 probably.
I missed all 3 of those games, ironically. This one jumps out at me as well. It's just outside the top 25, or maybe Texas A&M has stayed in the top 25. I would think that they have, since they beat Kentucky last week. But here's a team, the Aggies, that have played extremely well, aside from the Alabama game, which is almost understandable at this point, losing to Alabama by roughly 20 points, but beating Kentucky, playing within 2 points of Clemson. Texas A&M's put together a very solid football team. They seem to be markedly, decidedly better than South Carolina, but they go on the road. They're a slim 2-point favorite.
Yeah, the setup here concerns me a bit, though, because they are coming off that overtime home win against Kentucky. Now they have to travel for only their second true road game of the season. The only other road game was that Alabama game on September 22nd. The scheduling situation looks a little bit better for South Carolina that remains at home after a lackluster win against Missouri. South Carolina also has revenge from a 24-17 loss at A&M last year. In fact, it's double revenge. They also lost as a big home dog. In fact, 2 years ago, the last time they played here, South Carolina was a 20.5-point underdog. So that's how much they've improved the last couple of seasons. In fact, the beginning of the year, I would have thought South Carolina would have been favored in this game, and they were a play-on team for me. But they're just 2-2 against the spread and straight up their last 4 games. And because of that, they're now the home dog. A question for me here is just how much that game last week took out of A&M. They are playing better football overall, but the scheduling situation looks better for Carolina this week.
North Carolina is awful. They've been awful for 2 seasons now. I got to think that Larry Fedora is on the hot seat primarily, but that's another subject. Virginia Tech goes to North Carolina, and Tech's coming off a bit of a beating against Notre Dame, but 17-16 at halftime. It stretched out to a score, and then they slowly let it get away from them, as was expected against a touchdown favorite in Notre Dame. A significantly better team, decidedly better, probably one of the top 10 teams in the country, where Virginia Tech's more of a top 30 type team. But they go to North Carolina, not a daunting place to play, and they're only a 5.5-point pick against the Tar Heels.
Yeah, I mean, the real question for me here is which Virginia Tech team shows up. Is it the one that was flat against Old Dominion on the road, or is it the one that's played better the last 2 weeks? Now, normally you'd say, hey, it's the one that's played better the last 2 weeks, as they rebounded with a nice win against Duke after that bad loss at Old Dominion as a 28-point road favorite. But they were a road underdog in that game. They were still focused. They knew they were the underdog, and they obviously felt that way against Notre Dame. But I wonder what they have left of the tank now, because now that they've lost a second game, they know any national title hopes that they probably didn't have anyway at that point are definitely over. And I could see them having a flat spot here, especially the fact that they're a 6-point road favorite now against a team they've beaten 59-7 and 34-3 the last couple years. So even though they're the better team here, this scheduling spot definitely concerns me for Virginia Tech this week.
Now, certainly for Justin Fuente, his selling job to his team is that we lost 2 games out of conference. We still have a conference championship in play. And of course, North Carolina, you would think, couldn't be overlooked. But here's an interesting setup, because I heard 2 playoff discussions concerning the Pac-12's life support type play into a college football playoff, and none of those discussions involved Colorado. I understand their best games and most difficult games are lying in front of them, but they did just beat Arizona State at home, and they've got USC coming up at the Coliseum. Colorado sitting at 5-0. They go to USC. Of course, the Trojans have what's considered the more talented roster, which of course plays into the Vegas line as a full touchdown favorite.
This reminds me a lot of the game last week, Kentucky, Texas A&M, where we had a team that's really played better than most people expected, undefeated in Kentucky going into A&M, and the line looked high, and it probably was higher than it should have been. And A&M was fortunate to cover, as you mentioned earlier, 5.5-point favorite. They win by 6 in overtime. This game reminds me a lot of the same here. I like USC in this situation. I wish the line was less than 7. If you look at how these 2 teams have played this year, I don't think USC would even rate as the better team right now. So it definitely should not be 7 points. With that said, though, I do think Colorado loses this game, and the national title talks take a quick break with them. They also are at Washington next week. So, yeah, their season's going to end sooner than later. But right now at 5-0, they do control their own destiny, but I think that ends this week.
Steve Merril joining us from Pro Sports Info. So we do this live stream each and every Friday. We're going to update you on in which direction we may take this segment in future weeks for planning purposes, and also remind you that starting last week, so it's available this afternoon, we will have Steve's take on the top 3 games of the week, plus a sleeper pick. So just his thoughts about the line on 3 games of my selection, which I consider to be the top 3 games of the week, plus a sleeper pick. And that will be available to you at SG1 Sports. So we may or may not touch up on those games right here. I believe this will be one, though, because this line jumps out to me as well. Michigan at 6.5 to open, now at 9.5 against what's a pretty capable Wisconsin team.
Yeah, no question. This line looks big when you consider that Wisconsin is a good run-based defensive underdog, something I always look for, when handicapping really any sport is a good defensive dog. And Wisconsin giving up just 16 points a game. They rush for almost 290 yards per game on the ground. However, Michigan's defense is fantastic. They returned only 1 starter last year. Now they're a veteran squad. They're good on both sides of the ball. And then you factor in also the 24-10 revenge motive they have from last year's loss at Wisconsin. I like Michigan in this game. I just wish the line was still less than 7. It does look a little pricey right now for a good defensive team like Wisconsin. I could see them losing this game, but staying within that number.
Got Steve Merril on the line from Pro Sports Info. Please join him right there, prosportsinfo.com. We've got a request from the live chat to take a look at Nebraska Northwestern. Of course, the Huskers still searching for that first outright win. Northwestern just a field goal to 3.5-point favorite at home. Northwestern's an odd team. They lost to Akron. They took Michigan to the wire. They beat Michigan State on the road. They come back home. I know that it's not an outstanding home field advantage for the Wildcats, but just a field goal over Nebraska.
Well, Nebraska's yet to win, but they did cover for the first time last week. They were a 18.5-point dog at Wisconsin. They lost by 17. So
yeah, I know that well too.
So I mean, basically, they're less than a field goal away from being 0-5 against the spread this year. I talked about this for several weeks now with teams like Nebraska. You have to wait to see them do something. It's like Louisville I mentioned earlier in this segment. I'm not going to try to catch a falling knife and guess when they turn things around. I do think they will at some point. Scott Frost actually worked wonders at Central Florida. He has more talent to work with in Nebraska. But I don't want to try to guess which week it's going to be. Would not surprise to see it be this week because Northwestern, as you mentioned, Mark, has been a Jekyll and Hyde team. Prior to their 10-point underdog upset win last week against Michigan State, they lost 3 in a row, and they had lost 2 of those 3 outright as a favorite. In fact, they're 0-2 straight up as a favorite this season. So they've obviously underperformed against weaker teams. Thing is, when Nebraska comes to town, it still gets your attention. So I'm not sure Northwestern overlooks this. But yeah, I'd probably lean towards Nebraska this week. But I'd still much rather see them turn it around first before we really start backing them on a regular basis.
I'm going to throw out a few games that I don't think are going to be any surprises to people that even mildly follow the betting lines, but they're obviously huge, huge games. And that's Washington going to Oregon. The Huskies a 3.5-point favorite.
Yeah, I mean, Washington is a team that if you like Washington, you have to not only root for them, but you have to root for Auburn since they lost to them in week 1. And now Auburn's lost not only to LSU, but Mississippi State last week has really hurt, I think, the Huskies' chances as well. They obviously have to win out here in the Pac-12. If they do so, I think they probably still get a bid. But coming into this season, I'd said, that the Pac-12 is going to be way down this year. It looks to be the case. This is a difficult spot for Washington. Other than this game, they've got a November 3rd home game against Stanford. These are their 2 biggest games of the season to remain undefeated in the Pac-12. Oregon, though, has a big revenge mode of 38-3 revenge from last season. Plus, they come in here off a bye. There's several good technical indicators that favor Oregon here. Quality home dogs with a big revenge mode of off a bye week are over a 60% play against the spread for several decades now. So that definitely favors Oregon here, especially at 3.5 or more, the key number.
And Mario Cristobal maybe could learn from the Stanford game, and if he's got the opportunity to kneel near the end of the game, then he may actually do that rather than mess up my pick of plus 2.5 against Stanford and fumble the ball with 45 seconds left.
Yeah, no question about it. It's amazing how many of these games are determined by, we all call them bad beats, but keep in mind 50% of the people thought that was a fortunate win.
Exactly. Yes, for all the bad beats, there are some lucky suckers on the other side, of course, that had to turn their way. Georgia, a powerhouse coming into the season based on what they accomplished last year, the recruiting rankings. This is one of the big power elite programs in the country, have yet to be tested. We thought that might come at South Carolina. The Gamecocks turned out to be a pretender. They get their first test at LSU. I'm not surprised by the line, considering LSU is squeaked by. They're a conservative team. They finally lost last week at Florida. So LSU considered a good team, a top 15 to 20 team, but Georgia, one of the very best, a full touchdown favorite on the road in Death Valley.
Yeah, I mentioned last week, LSU was a team I wanted to go against with Florida. I thought the wrong team was favored, and that obviously played out well. You look at what LSU's done this year. Their win against Miami of Florida in week 1. One of the things I said last week analyzing that Florida game was we didn't really know about Miami, so they'd been a double-digit favorite in every game since. And then last week, they very well could have lost to Florida State as a 2-touchdown favorite. So Miami looking a bit overrated as I thought they were coming into the season. After the 10 wins last year, I didn't think they were quite as good as everybody thought. And then, of course, Auburn once again loses last week. They're not looking as strong now. So LSU maybe isn't as great as everybody thought. I think Georgia is very good, but this is a big number. I mean, LSU is still a home dog of a touchdown, and they should show up here. Now, the one concern you do have is how they respond off that loss. Normally, teams that lose their first game after a 5-0 start over the last few decades have been about a 60% play against. However, I think you have to be very careful with that angle nowadays, because with the new playoff format, which we've only had for a few seasons, a one-loss team, especially an SEC one-loss team, knows that they can still make the playoffs. So I think LSU still shows up. I don't think there's as much of a hangover from that Florida loss as there maybe would have been 10, 15 years ago.
Get Steve Merril on the line from Pro Sports Info. We're hitting all the big games in college football week 7. But before we hit the last one, I'd like to target here, Steve. Any difference in your record? Because this is something you've alluded to the last several weeks in regards to finding plays on the lower level, the group of 5. Of course, I'm running through the games of interest for my audience, the big games. But do you see a big difference in terms of your success going into the group of 5?
Yeah, it's funny. Nowadays, most a big Power 5, and I don't do that on purpose. I just find that those games are easier to handicap because you get a true handicap. The analogy I'll use is like a bad horse track. You know, if you go to Churchill Downs or the Triple Crown races or the Breeder Cups, you know you're getting the best of every horse. You can really kind of compare apples to apples, where if you go to some, you know, low-rent harness track, you don't know what's going on. And I almost feel like the MAC, the Sun Belt, even Conference USA, how far have they fallen in recent years? You're really handicapping Division I AA now, because half of those teams, like an Old Dominion or a Texas State, they were all FCS teams within the last decade. So I don't feel like it was in the late 90s when the MAC lines first came out. I used to find a ton of value there because they were always 1A teams. But now a lot of these conferences have a mishmash of former 1A and 1AA teams. And I've really stayed away from it in the last 4 or 5 years because I just feel like you get more random results, just like those big 5-touchdown spreads we talked about. I'm starting to see the same thing in the lower level college football conferences. And I prefer to kind of look at the pedigree, you know, the Class A teams in those Power 5 conferences for that reason.
Michigan State's one of the more disappointing teams across the country at 3-2. They just lost to Northwestern by 10 points as a 10-point favorite. They did the same at Arizona State earlier this year as a close to touchdown favorite. They brought back 20 or 21 starters. I didn't feel that they were going to be an elite team, but I certainly felt them. I picked them 8-4, which they could certainly still attain. But to see them with 13.5 points at Penn State, and I know the Nittany Lions are awfully explosive, but I'm believing in Mark D'Antonio, at least at this point. I haven't thought it through, but Mark D'Antonio, certainly a track record of, hey, we lack respect, we're not considered elite, and then bouncing back and getting his team to play.
Yeah, and it looks like this line's not going to hit that key number of 14. It opened over 14.5, came back down to 13.5, and now it's hit 13, even 12.5 in a lot of spots on Fridays. So it looks like you're not going to be able to get a full touchdown, 2 touchdowns in Michigan State. So I think the bettors, Mark, are kind of agreeing with you that this line's a little inflated. The bye week came at the perfect time, though, for Penn State. You could not have asked for a better bye situation than to have it last week after they blew that lead against Ohio State, gave up the late 2 scores there to lose by a single point. I think it could have been a real flat spot otherwise. It'll be interesting to see if they do regroup now with the extra time off. You know, I think the buys always help teams that are coming off a bad loss or struggling, whereas teams off a win don't need the buy. And the Redskins are a good example of that. Last Monday night, they had the nice 2-1 start. They beat the Green Bay Packers outright. Then they got that buy in week 4, which they didn't really need, and they got smoked by the Saints on Monday Night Football. I think it's the opposite here for Penn State. I think the bye week comes at a really good time. They also have a revenge mode of 27-24 loss last year as a 9.5-point road favorite at Michigan State. So the scheduling setup looks really good for Penn State. And now that it's below 2 touchdowns, the line isn't quite as daunting.
I'm always amused by the term lock because I've never come across a lock unless we're talking about, again, just the straight play Alabama-Arkansas, which probably wasn't even available. But somebody on the live chat is calling South Florida at -7 a lock at Tulsa tonight.
Yeah, it's there's not many locks anymore. The only way you get a key to one of these locks is if you get the Saturday newspaper for tonight's games. That's what works well for me. But yeah, I think you could what you got to look at is situational setups in these games, and then you try to find line value. So when I'm handicapping the 50+ games, what I'm looking for is I want the situation to match. I don't want to worry about a letdown like that Florida Vanderbilt game. You know, will Florida be flat or not? We just don't know. So you have to be careful with letdown situations. And then when you find a situation that works, you look for line value. Like those 3 underdogs that won outright last week. I thought all 3 of those teams should have been favored. I thought the situation with them at home was focused and they should be favored. So we had line value at a good spot. This game tonight, South Florida's 5-0 start. They're traveling for the 2nd week in a row now in a short week. Tulsa off of 4 straight losses. Obviously, South Florida is the much better team and they should roll in this game. But sometimes these national TV Friday night games, especially with an underdog like Tulsa, this is their bowl game basically. So that motivational angle is difficult to handicap for that reason.
Got Steve Merril on the line from Pro Sports Info. Stay right here to Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. I'll keep you updated on what Steve and I have planned for future weeks. But you can later this afternoon check out Steve's take on the top 3 games of college football week 7 and also a sleeper pick. We'll be back again with that later this afternoon. Steve, we appreciate you joining us.
Thanks, Mark.